The sound of snapping branches still wakes me up at night. Not from nightmares, but from memory. Because for 3 days in the Cascade Forest, every footstep could have been my last. My husband David knew those woods better than anyone. Every trail, every hiding spot, every place where screams get swallowed by ancient pines. He planned it perfectly. What he didn't plan on was his identical twin brother Daniel finding me first. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The call came on a Thursday morning in late September, while I was pricing vintage furniture for my client's lake house renovation. David's voice carried that particular strain it got when he was trying too hard to sound casual. "Sarah," he said, and I could hear him pacing in his construction office. "I've been thinking about us. About how we used to be before everything got complicated." I set down the ceramic lamp I was examining and walked to the window. Pine Ridge spread out below me, autumn leaves turning the mountainside into a tapestry of gold and crimson. David and I had been separated for 6 weeks. Not legally, just practically. He'd moved back to his childhood room above his mother's garage after our last fight, the one where he'd punched a hole through our bathroom door because I'd mentioned seeing a marriage counselor. "What kind of thinking?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. He'd been sending mixed signals for weeks. Flowers one day, angry texts the next. His mother Helen kept calling to tell me how heartbroken he was, how much he missed me, how I needed to stop being so stubborn and work things out. "The kind where I remember why I fell in love with you," he said. "Remember that spot we used to go to, up by the old cabin, where we carved our initials in that massive oak? I want to take you there this weekend. Just us, no distractions, no phones. Like when we were dating." The memory hit me before I could stop it. David at 25, all easy charm and weekend adventures. He'd take me hiking through trails his grandfather had shown him, pointing out wildlife tracks and edible plants. We'd spend hours at that cabin, talking about dreams and making plans. He proposed there on a crisp October morning 3 years ago, the ring hidden inside a thermos of hot chocolate. That was before I learned about his temper. Before the controlling behavior started creeping in like morning fog, so gradual I barely noticed until I was completely surrounded. Before he started questioning every friend I had, every place I went, every decision I made without consulting him first. "I don't know, David. Things have been really complicated lately. I need more time to think. Come on, Sarah, one weekend. If it doesn't help, I'll stop calling. I'll give you all the space you want. But we owe it to ourselves to try one more time in the place where it all started." There was something in his voice I couldn't identify. Not quite desperation, but close. David had always been persistent. But this felt different. More urgent. I found myself agreeing before I'd fully decided, something about the vulnerability in his tone catching me off guard. "Okay," I said. "One weekend." "Perfect," he replied, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "I'll pick you up Saturday morning at 8. Pack for camping. And Sarah, leave your phone. Let's make it like the old days. No outside world, just us." After I hung up, I sat in my small apartment above the coffee shop, second-guessing the decision. Lisa would kill me if she knew. My best friend had been the one to help me find this place when I'd finally worked up the courage to leave. She'd seen the bruises David claimed were accidents, heard about the increasingly frequent arguments that always somehow became my fault. But maybe he really had changed. Maybe the separation had given him perspective. People could change, couldn't they? Especially when they realized what they were about to lose. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzling, typical Oregon fall weather. David pulled up in his extended cab pickup, the one with the custom toolbox and mud flaps he was so proud of. He looked good, I had to admit. He'd gotten a haircut and was wearing the green flannel shirt I'd bought him for his birthday. His smile seemed genuine as he loaded my weekend bag into the truck bed. "You look beautiful," he said, kissing my cheek. "Like you did when we first met." I slid into the passenger seat, noting how clean he'd gotten the interior. David was usually careless about things like that, leaving coffee cups and work papers scattered around. Today, everything was spotless, almost like he'd prepared for inspection. The drive to the forest took 45 minutes, winding through progressively narrower roads until pavement gave way to gravel, then dirt. David chattered easily about work, about his brother Daniel getting promoted to head ranger, about how his mother was doing since his father's retirement. Normal conversation, the kind we used to have before everything became an argument. I started to relax despite myself. Maybe this really could be a fresh start. Maybe I'd been too quick to judge, too unwilling to forgive. The Mitchell family cabin appeared through the trees like something from a fairy tale, all weathered logs and stone chimney. David's grandfather had built it in the 1960s as a hunting retreat, and it had remained virtually unchanged since then. No electricity, no running water, just basic shelter and a stone fireplace for warmth. David parked behind the cabin where his truck wouldn't be visible from the main trail. He'd always been security conscious, but something about the deliberate way he positioned the vehicle made me uneasy. Like he didn't want anyone to know we were there. "Remember this place?" he said, shouldering both our bags before I could reach for mine. "All our best memories are here." He was right about that. We'd spent countless weekends at the cabin during our first year together. David teaching me to identify bird calls, showing me how to start a fire without matches, pointing out which berries were safe to eat. He'd been patient then, encouraging. The kind of man who made me feel capable and protected at the same time. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Inside, the cabin felt smaller than I remembered. David had already stocked it with supplies, I noticed. Canned food, bottled water, sleeping bags laid out by the fireplace. More supplies than we'd need for 2 days. But David had always been a planner. "I brought coffee," he said, holding up a thermos. "Your favorite blend from that place downtown. Why don't you get settled while I get a fire going?" I wandered around the single room while he worked with kindling and newspaper. Everything looked exactly the same. The mismatched furniture his grandfather had collected over the years. The mounted deer head that had always made me slightly uncomfortable. The wooden table, where we'd played endless games of cards by lantern light. But something felt off. Maybe it was just the context, returning here after months of fighting and separation. Or maybe it was the way David kept glancing at me, like he was studying my reactions. There was an intensity to his attention that reminded me of the later days of our marriage, when I'd started feeling like I was being watched and evaluated constantly. The coffee he poured was perfect, exactly how I liked it. We sat by the growing fire, talking about safe topics. Work projects, mutual friends, plans for the holidays. David was being his most charming self, the version of him I'd fallen in love with. Funny, attentive, genuinely interested in what I had to say. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself wondering why I'd been so resistant to this trip. David seemed genuinely committed to working things out. He apologized for his behavior during our last fight, acknowledged that he'd been under stress and taking it out on me unfairly. He talked about anger management classes he'd been looking into, couples therapy he was willing to try. When evening came, we cooked dinner together over the fire. Canned chili and cornbread. Simple camping food that tasted better than any restaurant meal. David told stories about his childhood, about coming to this cabin with his twin brother Daniel every summer, how they'd pretend to be explorers, mapping the forest and building elaborate forts. "It's funny," he said, poking at the fire with a long stick. "Daniel and I look exactly the same, but we're complete opposites. He's always been the responsible one, following rules, helping people, trying to save the world one hiker at a time. Me, I've always been more impulsive, more willing to take risks to get what I want." There was something in the way he said it that made me look up from my bowl. His expression had shifted slightly, become more calculating. The charm was still there, but underneath it was something harder. "What kind of risks?" I asked. "The kind most people wouldn't understand," he said. "The kind where you have to be absolutely certain about what you want before you commit. Because once you start down that path, there's no going back." I set down my spoon, appetite suddenly gone. "David, what are you talking about?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Us, Sarah. I'm talking about us. About making sure we don't make the same mistakes again." The fire crackled between us, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, the wind had picked up, making the trees creak and sway. The sound that had once felt peaceful now seemed ominous, like the forest itself was warning me about something. "I think I should call Lisa," I said, reaching for my purse. "Let her know I made it here safely. No phone, remember?" David's voice was still pleasant, but firm. "That was the deal. No outside world this weekend." "I know, but I just want to send a quick text. She'll worry if she doesn't hear from me." David reached over and took my purse before I could open it. "Sarah," we agreed. "No distractions. Just you and me, working on us." The way he said it, the way he held my purse just out of reach, triggered every alarm bell that had been quietly ringing since we'd arrived. This wasn't the romantic gesture I'd convinced myself it was. This was something else entirely. "Give me my purse, David." "After this weekend," he said. "After we've had a chance to really talk. Without interference from your friends who don't understand our relationship. My friends who don't understand." That's what he'd started calling Lisa, and anyone else who'd suggested I deserved better treatment. Who'd noticed the bruises and the way I'd started making excuses for David's behavior. I stood up, my heart rate increasing. "I want to go home. Now." David stood too, still holding my purse. He was bigger than me, stronger, and suddenly, the isolated cabin felt less like a romantic retreat and more like a trap. "Sarah, sit down. We're going to finish this conversation." "No, we're not. I'm leaving." I started toward the door, but David moved to block my path. His expression had changed completely now, the mask of charm finally slipping away. In its place was the cold anger I'd learned to fear during the last months of our marriage. "You're not going anywhere," he said quietly. "Not until we settle this once and for all." That's when I realized the terrible truth about this weekend trip. David hadn't brought me here to reconcile. He'd brought me here to make sure I could never leave him again. And we were 8 miles from the nearest road, surrounded by thousands of acres of wilderness that he knew better than anyone. The sound of my own heartbeat seemed deafeningly loud in the sudden silence. Outside, the wind continued to howl through the trees, and I found myself wondering if anyone would even think to look for me here. David had been so careful, so thorough in his planning. Who would suspect that a romantic reconciliation trip had been something else entirely? I looked at the man I'd once loved, once trusted, once promised to spend my life with, and saw a stranger. Someone who'd been planning this moment for weeks, maybe months. Someone who'd decided that if he couldn't have me willingly, he'd find another way to keep me. The cabin door seemed impossibly far away. The windows were too small to climb through. And David stood between me and any hope of escape, holding my purse with my phone, my keys, my only connection to the outside world. "You're scaring me," I whispered. "Good," he said. "Maybe now you'll listen." The silence stretched between us like a taut wire ready to snap. David stood blocking the door, my purse dangling from his fingers like bait I'd never be able to reach. The fire behind him cast his shadow across the entire cabin, making him appear larger, more threatening than the man I'd shared a bed with for 3 years. "You want to know what scares me, Sarah?" he said, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper I'd learned to dread. "It's watching you throw away everything we built together, because some bitter friend convinced you that you deserved better than what we have." "Lisa's not bitter," I managed, though my throat felt like sandpaper. "She cares about me. Lisa doesn't know you like I do." David took a step closer, and I instinctively backed toward the stone fireplace. "She doesn't know how you get when you're stressed. How you shut down and push people away, instead of working through problems like adults. That's not what happened, and you know it." My voice was getting stronger, anger starting to cut through the fear. "You know exactly why I left." "Because you're selfish," he said matter-of-factly. "Because the moment things got difficult, you decided it was easier to run than to fight for us. I ran because you put your fist through a door 6 inches from my face. I ran because you started tracking my every move. I ran because living with you felt like walking on glass every single day." David's jaw tightened. "I never laid a hand on you. Not once. But you act like I'm some kind of monster because I have feelings about my wife spending more time with her friends than her husband." The way he said wife made my skin crawl. like I was property he'd misplaced and was now reclaiming. I glanced toward the window, calculating distances. The glass was old and thick, probably wouldn't break easily, and even if I made it outside, where would I go? David knew these woods better than anyone. He'd grown up exploring every trail, every hiding spot, every dead end. I'm not your wife anymore, David. Not in any way that matters. We've been separated for 6 weeks. The papers are already drawn up. His laugh was sharp and humorless. Papers that haven't been filed. A separation that can be fixed with the right conversation. That's why we're here, Sarah. To have that conversation without interference. And if I don't want to have it, then you'll sit here until you do. The casual way he said it chilled me, more than any shouting would have. This wasn't passionate anger or jealous rage. This was cold calculation. David had planned this moment, probably for weeks. The clean truck, the stocked cabin, the deliberate positioning away from any trails. Even the timing made sense now. Late September meant fewer hikers, shorter days, earlier onset of the rainy season that would make any rescue attempt more difficult. How long have you been planning this? I asked. Since the day you walked out, he said without hesitation. Since the day you decided that our marriage vows meant nothing to you. I backed another step toward the fireplace, feeling the heat from the flames against my legs. The poker was there, a heavy iron rod that could serve as a weapon if I could reach it without David noticing. But he was watching me too carefully, studying my movements like a predator tracking prey. David, this isn't going to work. People will notice I'm missing. Lisa expects me to call her tonight. If she doesn't hear from me, she'll come looking. Will she? David tilted his head, genuinely curious. Because I had coffee with Lisa yesterday afternoon. Told her all about our romantic weekend getaway. How excited you were to work things out. How you specifically asked not to be disturbed because you wanted to focus entirely on us. My heart sank. Lisa would believe that. She'd been encouraging me to give David another chance despite her reservations. She'd respect what she thought was my decision to try reconciliation without outside pressure. You're lying. Am I? David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. Want to hear the voicemail you left her yesterday? The one where you said you were turning off your phone for the weekend and would call her Monday? I stared at the device in his hand. My voice. My words. Except I'd never made that call. Voice synthesis apps are amazing these days, he continued conversationally. Feed them enough samples of someone's voice and they can recreate anything you want them to say. I've been recording our phone conversations for months, Sarah, building quite a collection. The technical skill required for something like that shouldn't have surprised me. David had always been good with technology, constantly upgrading his equipment and learning new software. What shocked me was the premeditation. The months of planning that had gone into this moment. You're sick, I whispered. I'm thorough. There's a difference. David pocketed the phone and moved closer. Do you want to know what else I'm thorough about? I know you've been seeing someone. What? No, I haven't. The accusation caught me completely off guard. Tuesday afternoons at the Millbrook Diner. Same table by the window. Same order, coffee with extra cream, blueberry muffin. But lately you've been ordering 2 coffees. Having quite intimate conversations with someone who makes you laugh the way you used to laugh with me. My blood turned to ice. He was talking about Daniel. David's own twin brother, who I'd been meeting occasionally to talk about David. Nothing romantic, nothing inappropriate. Just conversations with someone who understood the man I'd married better than anyone else. That's your brother, I said. We've been talking about you. About how to help you. My brother, David repeated, and something dark flickered across his face. My identical twin brother who's always been everyone's favorite. Saint Daniel, the park ranger who saves lost hikers and protects the environment. Who probably told you all about what a disappointment I am to the family. That's not true. Daniel loves you. He's worried about you. Daniel has been in love with you since the day I introduced you. David's voice was getting colder, more controlled. Did you think I wouldn't notice? The way he looks at you at family gatherings. The way he always takes your side in any disagreement. You're paranoid. Daniel has never been anything but appropriate. Appropriate. David smiled, and it was terrifying. Is that what you call meeting my wife behind my back? Filling her head with doubts about her marriage? He was trying to help me understand you, to figure out how to make things work between us. By telling you to leave me, by helping you find that apartment, by encouraging you to see a lawyer. How did he know about the lawyer? I'd only mentioned that to Daniel once, in confidence, during our last conversation. Unless David had been watching us. Recording us. The thought made me sick. You've been spying on us. I've been protecting my marriage. There's a difference. I reached behind me, fingers searching for the fireplace poker. David was maybe 6 feet away now, close enough that I could see the calculation in his eyes. He was enjoying this, I realized. The control, the fear in my face, the way I was trapped with nowhere to run. My fingers closed around the iron handle just as David lunged forward. I swung the poker as hard as I could, catching him across the shoulder. He stumbled backward with a grunt of pain and surprise, giving me just enough space to dart around him toward the door. The cabin door was heavy and warped from years of weather. It stuck for a crucial second before flying open, sending me stumbling onto the wooden porch. Behind me, David was already recovering, cursing and shouting my name. I ran into the forest without looking back. The trails around the cabin were familiar from years of weekend visits. But in the gathering darkness and my state of panic, everything looked different. The path I thought led back toward the main road seemed to curve in the wrong direction. Trees that should have been landmarks were invisible in the shadows. Behind me, I could hear David crashing through the underbrush. He had a flashlight, the beam sweeping back and forth as he tracked my movement. I tried to stay quiet, stepping carefully to avoid snapping branches, but fear made me clumsy. Every sound seemed amplified in the night air. "Sarah!" His voice echoed through the trees. "You're only making this harder on yourself. You know these woods as well as I do. There's nowhere to go." He was right about that. The Cascade Forest stretched for thousands of acres in every direction. Without a compass or GPS, it would be easy to walk in circles for days. And David knew every trail, every shortcut, every dead end. This was his territory, and I was lost in it. I pressed myself against a massive pine tree, trying to control my breathing while David's flashlight beam swept past. The bark was rough against my back, and I could smell the rich scent of pine needles and damp earth. Normal forest smells that had once been comforting but now felt ominous. "Come on, Sarah," David called out. His voice was closer now, maybe 50 feet away. "Be reasonable. You can't stay out here all night. It's going to get cold, and there are bears in these woods. Mountain lions, too. You remember what happened to that hiker last spring?" I remembered. A woman from Portland had been attacked while camping alone. They'd found her body 3 days later, mauled beyond recognition. The incident had made national news and reinforced every horror story about the dangers of the Oregon wilderness. "I've got food back at the cabin," David continued. "Warm clothes, a fire. All you have to do is stop running and we can work this out like civilized people." His tone was reasonable, almost persuasive. If I hadn't seen the cold calculation in his eyes, hadn't heard him describe months of surveillance and planning, I might have been tempted to believe him. But I knew better now. David hadn't brought me here to reconcile. He'd brought me here to eliminate the problem I'd become. The flashlight beam swung in my direction again, and I held my breath. The light passed over the tree trunk inches from my face, then moved on. David was being systematic, searching in a grid pattern. Eventually, he'd find me. I waited until his footsteps moved farther away, then crept deeper into the forest. The undergrowth was thick here, full of fallen logs and tangled brambles that caught at my clothes. I moved as quietly as possible, feeling my way in the darkness. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, I found a small clearing where moonlight filtered through the canopy. In the distance, I could see the faint glow of the cabin's fire through the trees. David had given up the active search and returned to wait for me. He knew I'd have to come back eventually. I had no supplies, no shelter, no way to call for help, but at least I was free for now. And freedom, even temporary freedom, was better than the alternative. I settled against a fallen log to think. The night air was getting colder, and I was wearing only jeans and a sweater. If I stayed out here until morning, hypothermia would become a real risk. But going back to the cabin meant walking into David's trap. There had to be another option. Other cabins in the area, maybe? Or a ranger station. Daniel worked for the Forest Service. He'd know these woods even better than David, and he'd have radio equipment, weapons, backup. If I could find him, if I could get to his station. But where was it? I tried to remember conversations from family gatherings, Daniel talking about his work. He'd mentioned being assigned to the North District, covering the area around Mirror Lake. That was maybe 5 miles from here, if I could find the right trail. 5 miles through dark forest, with no compass, and a dangerous man hunting me. It seemed impossible. But the alternative was going back to that cabin and whatever David had planned for me there. I stood up, brushing pine needles from my clothes. In the distance, a twig snapped. Then, another. David was moving again, resuming his search. The flashlight beam was sweeping back and forth, getting closer. I moved deeper into the forest, away from the light, away from the cabin, toward what I hoped was north. The ground was uneven and treacherous in the darkness. I stumbled over roots and rocks, caught my face on low branches, felt thorns tear at my clothes. But I kept moving. Behind me, David's voice echoed through the trees. "You can't hide forever, Sarah. I know these woods better than you ever will, and I've got all the time in the world." His words followed me into the darkness like a curse. But for the first time since arriving at the cabin, I felt something other than fear. I felt determination. David might know these woods, but he'd underestimated me. He'd expected me to be passive, to accept whatever fate he'd planned. Instead, I was going to fight. I was going to survive. And somehow, I was going to make him pay for what he'd done. The forest stretched endlessly ahead of me, full of dangers and uncertainty. But it also held the possibility of escape, of rescue, of justice. I just had to be smart enough and strong enough to find it. The forest floor was a minefield of obstacles in the darkness. Every step required careful placement to avoid the roots and rocks that could send me tumbling down the mountainside. My hands were already scraped from catching myself on tree bark and thorny bushes. But I pressed forward, guided only by patches of moonlight filtering through the canopy above. I'd been walking for what felt like hours when I heard the sound that made my blood freeze. Not David's voice calling my name or his flashlight cutting through the trees. Something worse. The low rumble of an engine starting up back at the cabin. David had given up searching on foot. He was going mobile. The realization hit me like a physical blow. His truck could cover ground I'd never match walking. He could drive to trail intersections, cut off escape routes, position himself between me and any hope of reaching civilization. The network of logging roads and fire breaks that crisscrossed these mountains would give him access to areas I couldn't even find in daylight. I pushed myself to move faster, stumbling over fallen logs and crashing through undergrowth that seemed determined to hold me back. Behind me, the engine sound was getting closer. David knew exactly where the roads were, which ones connected to which trails. He was probably already calculating the most likely paths I'd take, setting up to intercept me. The moon disappeared behind a thick bank of clouds, plunging the forest into complete darkness. I had to slow down, feeling my way from tree to tree like a blind person navigating an unfamiliar room. My sweater caught on something sharp, tearing with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the still air. That's when I heard the truck stop. A door slammed somewhere to my left, closer than I'd expected. David's voice carried through the trees, no longer the reasonable tone he'd used at the cabin. This was raw anger, barely controlled. "I can hear you out there, Sarah." Breaking branches, tearing through the brush like a wounded animal. "You're making enough noise to wake the dead." I pressed myself against the nearest tree, trying to become invisible. The bark was rough and cold against my cheek, and I could smell the damp earth beneath layers of decomposing leaves. Everything about this place that had once seemed peaceful now felt threatening. You know what the funny thing is? David continued, his voice moving as he walked along what must have been a trail or road. I actually thought you might have learned something from our marriage. Learned to think before you acted. But here you are, running blind through dangerous terrain, probably getting yourself more lost by the minute. He was right about that. Without landmarks or a sense of direction, I could be walking in circles. The forest all looked the same in the darkness, and panic wasn't helping my navigation skills. But going back wasn't an option. Whatever David had planned for me at that cabin, it wasn't reconciliation. I remember the first time I brought you hiking, his voice continued, conversational now. You were so worried about getting lost. Made me promise we'd stick to marked trails, that I'd keep track of where we were at all times. You trusted me to keep you safe. Ironic, isn't it? A branch snapped somewhere close by. Too close. I held my breath and tried to sink deeper into the shadows, but shadows were all I had. No real cover, no place to hide that would stand up to determined searching. The beam of a powerful flashlight swept across the trees above my head. David had upgraded from whatever he'd been using before. This light was bright enough to turn night into harsh, artificial day wherever it pointed. It moved methodically, checking behind every tree, every bush large enough to conceal a person. I know you're close, Sarah. I can feel you out there. Scared, cold, probably starting to realize how stupid this whole thing was. All you had to do was listen. All you had to do was give us a real chance to work things out. The light was getting closer. In another few seconds, it would find me, and then there would be nowhere left to run. I looked desperately around for options, and spotted something that might work. A massive fallen tree, its trunk easily 4 feet in diameter, had created a natural shelter where it had crashed into a cluster of smaller pines. The space underneath was dark and cramped, but it might be enough to hide in. I dropped to my hands and knees and crawled toward the fallen giant as quietly as possible. The space beneath was tight, filled with spider webs and the musty smell of rotting wood. But it was concealment. I wiggled as far back as possible and tried to control my breathing. David's footsteps were right on top of me now, so close I could hear the rustle of his jacket as he moved. The flashlight beam swept back and forth overhead, probing the darkness with mechanical precision. I closed my eyes and tried to make myself as small as possible. Sarah, I know you can hear me. David's voice was directly above the log now, casual and conversational. Let me tell you what's going to happen. You're going to stay out here until you get tired, cold, and scared enough to see reason. Then you're going to come back to the cabin, and we're going to have the conversation we should have had years ago. The beam passed over the log, illuminating the bark inches from my face. I could see every detail of the rough surface, every insect that called it home. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure David would hear it. Or, he continued, you can keep playing hide and seek until you collapse from exhaustion or hypothermia. Your choice. But either way, this ends with you understanding that you belong with me. His footsteps moved away, but I didn't dare breathe normally yet. David was smart enough to fake leaving, to wait and see if I'd emerge too early. I forced myself to count to 100, then 200, before carefully poking my head out of the hiding spot. The forest was quiet again. No flashlight, no footsteps, no engine noise. But that didn't mean David was gone. It just meant he was being more careful now, more strategic. He'd realized that crashing through the woods announcing his presence wasn't effective. Now, he'd try a different approach. I crawled out from under the log, my muscles stiff from the cramped position. Every part of my body ached, and my clothes were soaked through with moisture and dirt. The temperature was dropping steadily, and I was starting to shiver uncontrollably. Moving as quietly as possible, I tried to get my bearings. The clouds had cleared enough to reveal stars, but I'd never been good at navigation. The constellations were just random patterns of light to me, offering no guidance about which direction might lead to safety. What I needed was to find water. Streams in this area generally flowed north toward the Columbia River. If I could locate the seasonal creek that ran through this part of the forest, I could follow it downstream toward more populated areas. The question was how to find water in the dark without making noise that would draw David back. I stood still and listened, trying to filter out the sound of wind in the trees and my own nervous breathing. There, faintly, was the sound I was hoping for. The gentle murmur of moving water, somewhere off to my right. It was barely audible, but it was real. Following the sound meant moving away from what I thought was the direction of the main road. But the road hadn't helped me so far. David controlled the roads. My only advantage was going where he wouldn't expect, taking risks he'd assume I was too scared to take. The creek, when I finally found it, was smaller than I'd hoped. More of a trickle than a stream, picking its way over and around moss-covered rocks. But water was water, and it was moving downhill. I knelt and cupped some in my hands, drinking deeply despite the earthy taste. Following the creek meant walking in the water itself to avoid leaving tracks. The stones were slippery and uneven, and the cold water soaked through my shoes within minutes. But it was better than leaving a trail David could follow. I'd been picking my way downstream for maybe half an hour when I heard the sound that changed everything. Not David's truck or his voice, but something else entirely. The distant static of a radio transmission, too far away to make out words, but unmistakably electronic. A ranger. It had to be. Someone with communication equipment. Probably Daniel making his evening rounds. The sound was coming from somewhere ahead of me, downstream along the creek. If I could reach whoever it was, if I could get to that radio. I abandoned caution and started moving as fast as the treacherous creek bed would allow. The radio chatter was getting clearer, closer. I could almost make out individual words now, something about weather conditions and trail closures. The creek curved around a bend lined with thick alders, and suddenly I could see light ahead. Not the harsh beam of David's flashlight, but the warm yellow glow of a campfire. And silhouetted against that fire, the unmistakable outline of a man in a ranger's uniform. I wanted to call out, to run toward that blessed light in safety, but something held me back. What if it wasn't Daniel? What if it was another ranger who wouldn't believe my story, who might even contact David before checking my claims? I needed to be sure before I revealed myself. Creeping closer through the undergrowth, I tried to get a better look at the figure by the fire. He was tall and broad-shouldered like David, but his movements were different. More deliberate, more careful. When he turned his head to check something in his pack, I caught a glimpse of his profile. It was Daniel, David's identical twin brother, but I could tell the difference even in the uncertain light. Something about the way he carried himself, the lack of tension in his shoulders that David always seemed to have. I stepped out of the tree line, and Daniel's hand went immediately to his weapon. His training was showing, the automatic response to unexpected movement in the darkness. "Who's there?" he called out sharply. "This is Forest Service. Identify yourself." "Daniel, it's me, Sarah." His posture relaxed instantly, but confusion replaced alarm in his voice. "Sarah, what are you doing out here?" "David said you two were spending the weekend at the cabin." I stepped into the circle of firelight, and Daniel's expression changed from confusion to horror. My clothes were torn and dirty, my face was scratched from branches, and I was shivering uncontrollably from cold and shock. "Jesus, what happened to you?" "David," I managed through chattering teeth. "He trapped me. At the cabin I had to run." Daniel was already reaching for his radio, but I grabbed his arm. "Wait. He's been planning this for months. Recording my voice. Watching me. Setting me up. If you call this in through normal channels, he might intercept it. He knows all the frequencies, all the protocols." Daniel stared at me for a long moment, then slowly put the radio back on his belt. "Sarah, you're not making sense. David's my brother. He loves you. He's been devastated since you separated." "That's what I thought too. But Daniel, he's been surveilling me for months. He knows about our conversations at the diner. He thinks there's something between us." "There isn't anything between us," Daniel said quickly. "I know that. You know that. But David doesn't believe it. He's convinced himself that you're the reason I left him." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so identical to one David made that it was unsettling. But where David's version of that movement was usually angry or frustrated, Daniel just looked tired. "Okay," he said finally. "Let's say you're right. Let's say David has lost it completely. What exactly do you think he's planning to do? I don't know. But he made it clear, I'm not leaving that cabin until I agree to come back to him. And if I don't agree, you think he'd hurt you? I think he's already past that point. I think he brought me out here to make me disappear. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he looked up, his expression had hardened into something I'd never seen before. Something that looked remarkably like his twin brother in a rage. If that's true, Sarah, if David has really crossed that line, then we need to get you out of here right now. My truck is parked about a mile downstream. We can be at the sheriff's station in 30 minutes. It sounded too easy, too simple. But Daniel was here. He believed me, and he had the means to get me to safety. For the first time since leaving the cabin, I allowed myself to hope that this nightmare might actually end. That's when we heard the sound of David's truck engine, much closer than before, and getting closer by the second. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.